Well, welcome everybody. It's good to have you with us here today. My name's Tony, and I'm the founder and lead strategist for the Unstuck Group. And today's topic, we're talking about multi-stuck. Actually, we don't want you to be multi-stuck. And that's why we're going to be covering 4 common mistakes that we're seeing as we engage with churches, either taking their first steps into multi-site or churches that have already launched 2, 3, 4 different locations, and we're seeing some common challenges that even those churches are facing as well. And so today I'm being joined by a great panel. Let me make some quick introductions here. First of all, Gavin Adams is joining us. Gavin is the lead pastor of Woodstock City Church. That's in Woodstock, Georgia, just north of Atlanta. And Woodstock City Church is actually one of the campus's locations of North Point Ministries. So Gavin, welcome to the conversation today.
Tony, hey, thanks so much, man. Glad to be here.
And also with us, he's been with us on previous webinars, and folks just love Paul Alexander. Paul is the executive pastor of Sun Valley Community Church. And Paul, it's warm where you are today, isn't it?
Yeah, while the rest of the country has snowfall and freezing temperatures, I think it's going to be 90 degrees, blue skies, and palm trees here.
Well, we're just a little bit jealous. And then finally, but at least this is saving the best for last, Tammy Kelley is the creative arts pastor now at Christ Community Church, a great church, multiple locations in the Chicagoland area. In fact, all 3 of these folks on the panel today are working in great multi-site churches. And in her previous life, Tammy was also on the team at Willow Creek when they were launching locations in Chicago as well. So Tammy, welcome to today's conversation.
Thanks. Good to be here. Thanks.
And behind the scenes, we have Blake. Blake's also on the Unstuck Group team as one of our ministry consultants. You won't see his face today, but he's working in the chat room. And so if you have questions along the way about anything we're discussing related to multi-site, feel free to submit your questions in the chat, which you can find at the bottom of your screen if you're watching on your computer. And Blake will collect all those questions toward the end of our time. We'll make sure we provide some opportunity to respond to some of those questions. If we don't get to all of them, we'll try to provide responses and content that you'll see in the coming days as well. And by the way, another way you can engage the conversation is to just share your thoughts and observations from today's time on Twitter, and the Facebook, if you're into that. You can use hashtag multistuck if you're posting anything on social media today. So as I mentioned, today's focus is we're trying to help you avoid getting stuck when it comes to launching campuses. And we're going to be talking through 4 common mistakes that we see. And those mistakes up front, we're going to look at launching too small when it comes to multi-site strategy, launching with the wrong leader, and here primarily we're talking about the campus pastor, launching with the wrong location, and then finally launching with the wrong team. And I just want to dive into the conversation and begin with that first mistake, launching too small. And this is one of those things our team is noticing as we engage with churches, where it's just the sense that the number of resources when it comes to leaders, volunteers, financial resources, and then the capacity to support multiple locations. Generally, we're seeing instances where churches are launching too small. Paul, I want to begin with you. How essential do you think critical mass is before launching a second campus, and what size would you recommend?
Yeah, Tony, it's critical if the multi-site location is going to be successful 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the road. I'm not sure that there's a universal magic one size fits all for multi-site. There's a lot of different models out there, but you've got to ask yourself, what's the wise thing to do in our unique context with our unique culture of our church? I think the key question that our listeners and participants need to really wrestle with is, can the sending campus sustain the loss of staff, leaders, volunteers, attenders, and givers that are going to go to that new location? And can the core team that's starting that new campus be large enough to actually sustain it during the launch and the growth phase after that? So, generally, I wouldn't recommend going multi-site. If people want a number, I wouldn't necessarily recommend a church going multi-site until their original campus is averaging over 1,000 in average attendance. That being said, there's a lot of churches that are smaller than that are experimenting with multi-site. Leadership Network, a couple of years ago, through some research that they did that was good research, discovered that the average size that a church went multi-site was 850. And so I've seen some churches much larger go multi-site. I've seen some churches much smaller go multi-site. The issue is sustainability. Does the sending campus have the capacity to do it? And one more thing I'll add in there, Tony, is a lot of churches look to multi-site and starting a new location as something that's going to gain and build momentum for their original campus. The opposite is actually true. If the original campus isn't growing and doesn't have momentum, starting a new campus is actually going to drain momentum and energy from the original campus, not add it. So that's something I think that listeners need to be very aware of.
Okay, so with that in mind, if we're trying to get to critical mass before we launch, and actually even after we get to that size, before we launch, what are some other next steps that churches can be taking before they launch in a second or third or fourth location?
Yeah, sure. I think before you add a second or third or fourth location, Tony, always start adding additional services. Add 2, 3, 4, go to multiple days, do it on Saturday and Sunday. Add multiple venues on one campus, different styles or expressions. What that's going to do for your team's going to build the necessary technology and staffing muscles and volunteer muscles so that when you start a new campus, it's not completely new for you. You're already going to know how to do multi-venue, so it's easier to go multi-site.
That's good. And Paul, you have some experience when it comes to launching campuses. Give us a little bit of the background of what's happening at Sun Valley right now.
Yeah, so we just launched our 5th campus, and it launched with 1,800 people, and it settled down to 1,200. And it's very different than our past experience. So our first multi-site that we did, we had a handful of people driving up from a community 45 minutes away, and they're like, "We need a church like Sun Valley." And we're like, "You sure do." And and then we'd smile and wave, and eventually the resources became available to do that. And we've really learned a lot throughout our 5-year journey of multi-site of when we need to start building our core team, how large it needs to be in proportion to success, defining what success looks like, Tony. When do we actually hire our staff and start recruiting our staff for it? A lot has changed over that time period. So.
Very good. Very good.
All right, Tammy, let's just pull you into the conversation here. First of all, tell us about the church you're at currently. How many locations?
Sure. So we have 4 locations here in the Chicagoland area. So, yeah.
And before that, of course, at Willow Creek. So taking in your experience at your current church and from your experience at Willow Creek, what is your sense of the impact that critical mass plays when you're considering staffing for a new campus?
Sure. Yeah. So at the end of the day, you're going to need to have enough volunteers to both send to the new campus and sustain things at the main campus. To Paul's point, you want to have a critical mass of people already attending the main campus before you launch it, because every new launch takes a key piece of volunteers out. So you don't want to underestimate the number of volunteers that you're going to lose in critical roles when you start a new campus. And you want that. You want to send some of your best volunteers. You want to send some of your best staffers to the new campus, because that's going to be a better predictor of success. But you want to plan for it. So you want to look ahead 6 to 12 months ahead when you're thinking of launching the campus, and kind of look at what are the key roles that we're going to need at our new campus, who are going to be moving and filling in those roles, and what do we need to backfill at our main campus. Because quite honestly, if the new campus is within a 20-30 minute drive time, it's really fun for volunteers to be part of a new campus. It's like the adventure, and they feel needed. And you may be surprised the number of volunteers who really want to go and launch. And so then you just got to look backwards and backfill those positions. A quick example of that is I was working a couple years ago with a church who was starting their first multi-site, and it was going to be just a Sunday morning service. Their current main campus had 3 services. So all of a sudden they launched this new campus, and they're like, wait a minute, for our main campus, where did all of our bass players and drummers go? Well, they migrated over to the new campus because the new campus, we only had to play on Sunday morning, so they could do gigs on Saturday night. And so all of a sudden the main campus was left with less than adequate number of key musicians. So they actually had contractors for a season. So just, things to think about.
Very good. All right. So let me interrupt the conversation for a second. I'm not sure why, but it sounds like even folks that are just participating, watching the conversation, the sound's coming through. And so if you wouldn't mind making sure your mics are muted, just to make sure we're not picking up the audio from your locations as well. We would appreciate that. Sorry for that interruption. Paul, let me turn back to you. You've mentioned there's been a number of multi-site campuses that you've launched through Sun Valley. And I'm just curious to hear how your approach has changed as you've launched more campuses.
Yeah, well, in the early days, Tony, we didn't define success. We just thought starting a new campus and people meeting Jesus was success, but we didn't put a target and a number on the wall. And so our strategy has become much more refined. Our timeline to launch has become more refined. How we choose locations has become more refined. And the size. We've actually made a decision, and not every church is going to do this, but the decision we made is we're not going to launch a campus unless we know that first year it's going to be 1,000 in attendance. And so that's where we're at. So your listeners and your participants, they got to make a decision. Okay, what's the target on the wall? Is it going to be 500, 250? What's sustainable? How do you build that financial model and then the staffing model, and then back it on down to volunteers and leaders? It's got to make sense, or your original campus has got to be able to fiscally sustain it for a long enough time to where it can grow up and live on its own. Does that make sense?
It sure does. Hey, Paul, you mentioned, and it's not a magic number, but it's kind of a benchmark, that 1,000 people mark. Why specifically 1,000?
Okay, yeah, so that's a good question. It really comes down to sustainability. So if you launch with 500 people, for example, and 100 people walk out the door from that original campus, you go from having an original campus of 500 to an original campus of 100. Now you're staffed. If you're still staffed for a campus of 500, but now you only have 400 people coming, it messes with your staffing ratios, it messes with your giving ratios, it messes with your volunteer ratios. You can actually cripple your original campus if it doesn't have the strength to send out 100, 200, 300 people.
Yeah, and we're also trying to set up that new location with strength as well.
That's right.
And I usually say, whatever your launch team is, there's a good chance you're going to double that as far as attendance at launch. And so if you are sending out 10%, 100 people of that 1,000, there's a chance that you're going to launch with 200 in attendance at that location. And if that happens, then you've immediately jumped through some of those smaller church challenges and have critical mass then at the new location now too, to have strength at launch. And so that's I think we're both thinking along the same lines, both for sustainability of the sending location, but also to set up that second location for success as well. Well, let's turn the corner to the second mistake. We're going to be focusing here on launching with the wrong leader. And of course, we're focused here mainly on the role of the campus pastor. And Gavin, I want to pull you in here. You actually serve as the campus pastor, the lead pastor at the Woodstock City Church location for North Point. What are some of the traits that your team is looking for to identify the right campus pastor for a new location?
Hey, thanks, Tony. Yeah, there's a lot of great skill sets and traits I think we can look for. I don't know if there's one exact kind of person. However, there is a definite kind of person overall. There's a few things that we think about. One, we want full alignment with our mission and vision and values, because as a campus pastor, we're going to try to replicate the DNA of the sending location and replicate the experience of the sending location. So having that alignment with the DNA is obviously critically important. Because most multi-site organizations too are also really function as a matrix. There's a collaborative kind of element that is going to be required from the campus pastor to work with peers as well as the multi-campus staff, which means that they're going to have to be very self-aware at the same time. That's critically important. You're going to want people with great communication skills. The model may determine how frequently they're actually teaching, preaching, but every campus pastor is communicating vision, inspiring people to follow. So there are some critical things happening there that require great communication skills. You're going to want a person who's a developer of people, who can develop organizations, who can grow things. We definitely want leaders and not doers, because leaders can lead doers to get things done, but doers have trouble obviously leading others as well. And then the last thing, Tony, I would say we want someone who just has some genuine humility about them, because they're going to be leading in the second seat. And you're going to want a person who is a strong leader, yet also humble enough to defer to the point leader, the senior pastor, and who can be comfortable in that second seat.
That's great. Gavin, that brings me then to the obvious follow-up question. What are some early warning signs that it's just not the right fit, that you might have the wrong person in that role?
Well, hopefully we don't get to that point, right, Tony? But if we do, since a great campus pastor really is called to kind of contextualize and reproduce maybe the ministry best practices and the DNA of that sending church, when we begin to see any sort of lack of alignment, any sort of maybe degradation of quality or of excellence, that certainly would be a red flag. I think back to that humility piece. Whenever we bump into a leader who maybe doesn't seem willing to learn or isn't willing to receive feedback or even ask hard questions of their own leadership or what others are seeing in their campus, I think for us that would be a big red flag as well.
So Paul, let's ask the most obvious question here. What should a campus pastor actually do? What's the role really look like?
Well, I think to Gavin's point, a lot of it does depend on the model. If the model is where the campus pastor is not teaching, I agree. They're championing vision and culture, but they're really filling the gap between vision and what's actually happening on the ground. It's an execution role. So they're actually leading the team to accomplish the vision in a new context. And they're loving for and caring for the congregation, and they're leading the staff. I've had this conversation a couple times recently, even with just church members. Every once in a while they say, so if so-and-so is teaching and so-and-so is leading, what does the campus pastor actually do? And the best analogy I've been able to find that's gotten traction with people who actually attend the church in the everyday world is I say, think store manager. So if someone's managing a Target store, they're managing a Home Depot, they're making a lot of decisions every single day, but there's a lot of decisions they're not making. And so that seems to be the analogy that's gained the greatest traction with the average church attender.
That's good. So Gavin, as a follow-up then, as you were describing kind of the profile of the person that you're looking for, you mentioned communications there. And it, depending on the model, teaching every service may or may not be a part of it. But I'd love to hear your perspective, especially as a campus pastor, the importance of teaching. Talk to us a little bit about that. Should campus pastors be one of the communicators, one of the teachers at a campus?
Yeah, that's a great question. And here's the reality, and we're going to say this over and over. The model depends, or the model dictates a lot of how that campus pastor role will look ultimately. However, teaching provides campus pastors, or it provides any leader, within a level of credibility. Now, here's the tension, though. Not every campus pastor is really called or gifted to be a teacher. And so therefore, campus pastors who feel the burden to communicate because they believe it's a part of the leadership kind of DNA of being a pastor, but they're not called or gifted or really ready to do that, it actually hurts their credibility, and it may it may actually hamper their ability to lead well. So therefore, I think that an individual gifting is a huge part of that decision criteria between the lead pastor, the senior pastor, and the campus pastor. Now, for me, I do enjoy communicating, and our senior pastor gives me the flexibility to do that a relatively a good amount of time, which I do believe enhances the credibility that I have on our local campus, as a local church leader, because there are things as a local pastor I am wanting to lead or inspire our church to do well. The more credibility that I have as a leader locally, the easier it is for me to do that. But here's the other side, and here's why earlier, Tony, I said that a great communicator is required. It doesn't mean that we're all going to be teaching, but every campus pastor is casting vision. Every campus pastor is inspiring people to move, right, as a follower. And so for me, whether I'm preaching or not, every week, for virtually every week, I'm welcoming people from the platform, from the stage to the church. A lot of times I'm handling the inspirational kind of offering moment. So we call the welcome our navigation moment. We have inspiration moment in the offering section. There's 2 moments right there almost every week that I'm communicating. There's often dismissals with next steps. Again, they may be 2 or 3 or 4 minutes long, but they're critical and they're very important that we do it well. So as a communicator, whether I'm preaching 30-minute messages or not, we're communicating almost every week, and we're not even getting into the volunteer element where we're helping cast vision with our local volunteer teams and inspiring them to take their job seriously, to do it with excellence, things like that. So, I mean, I would argue, Tony, every week I'm communicating 2, 3, 4 times. It's just in different venues.
Yeah, and how in the North Point context, how do you try to discern whether someone has that capacity to communicate in that way? I'm assuming you're not just hiring people and throwing them on the platform on Sunday morning. What does that look like?
Yeah, now that's a little more complicated, right? When we're blessed in our kind of context to have multiple communication venues or environments. So everywhere from preschool through elementary, middle, and high school. I mean, those are 4 specific areas right there where we can allow people to kind of cut their teeth as a communicator. There's a lot of margin for error with our preschoolers, right? So we want it to be done very well, though. So we're able to coach and bring along communicators locally in those other areas, and then we can leverage, moments in the auditorium as well. Not to say that these moments aren't important, but there are summers and spring breaks and different, weekends that are just not going to be as crowded. They're not a lot more insiders than outsiders may be there. Not that we want to ever pass on a week and say it's not important, but there are easier times than not to give other communicators a chance. Now, Tony, at the same time, as we're kind of working with our younger communicators and bringing them along, we're not just throwing them to the wolves either. We're really helping them develop their voice, helping them learn to develop content, helping them learn the skill, the art of communication. But all of us know there's only so much learning that can be done without the reps. And so giving people repetitions is so critically important to their development. And the reality is that none of us want our churches to only be as good as we are. We want it to outlive us. In fact, we want it to be better with the next leader walking in. So there's a part of it, even for me, Tony, where I feel the burden to bring along other communicators and hopefully allow them to become way better than I will ever be.
Yeah. So the key takeaway for me in all of that was the development's not really happening on Sunday morning during the messages that are being delivered. The development's happening before the messages in other environments. And I think that's one of the mistakes that for the churches that are using as part of their model of campus pastors or teaching on Sunday, they're seeing that as the development time for expanding the teaching team. And really the development should have already happened. So very good. All right. Well, let's turn our attention to mistake number 3, launching in the wrong location. And the key thought I wanted you to consider here is that location is much more important than facility. And the mistake that I see churches making many times when it comes to multi-site is they're looking for the optimal facility and they sacrifice location, when in reality, those 2 decisions, it should be reversed. We should find the optimal location and then try to find the best facility that we can within that location. Tammy, I want to start with you. You were actually at Willow Creek when the leadership team began to search for and then launch those initial locations. What were some of the key factors that the team was considering as they were making those decisions about the location itself?
Yeah, so back in, I think it was 2001, 2002, we were in the process of building a new auditorium, and at the same time we were looking for our first multi-site location. So we did a lot of demographic studies around the Chicagoland area to get an idea of where were our Willow people driving from, and we were looking at those places that were 20 to 30 minutes away and feeling like that's where we wanted to plant or to launch a location for a couple of reasons. One is we wanted to serve those groups of people who were driving, 30 minutes or so to come to our main campus, because we wanted them to be able to be more involved in the life of the church. If they were 30 minutes away, they probably weren't volunteering very much. Their kids weren't able to be involved in some of the midweek activities, and also because they were just too far away. So we wanted to be able to serve that people group, and we also wanted to be able to have a significant core of people to be able to launch the campus there. So that was that key piece. We were looking at where were our people already driving from. We were trying to look at, is that a growing area? Is the community that we're looking at a growing population? We were looking at, is it a drive to versus a drive from community in the Chicagoland area? And I think in a lot of areas, there's places you can go during the week and it's hustling and bustling, and there's restaurants and people on the streets and all kinds of great things happening. And then you go there on the weekend and it's totally dead. And so we wanted to be able to make sure that we were a community where the families were at on the weekends, not just during the week. So that would be a suggestion. If you're thinking of launching in a community in a specific place, make sure that you go hang out there on the weekend, Saturday night, Sunday mornings, whenever you're thinking of launching your campus or your services, to make sure that there's actually things happening there. And then we also looked at, we do this at Christ Community Church, and we're looking to launch a campus too, is looking at a community that I would say needs our brand of church, meaning we don't want to necessarily set up right next door to another church that's very similar. There's no real need to do that. We are looking for some of those more unreached communities. And then at the end of the day, facility does matter. So I know we always say location trumps facility, but we did have to, at the end of the day, we had to find a facility for our new campus to launch in. All of Willow's campuses launched and rented or leased facilities. Christ Community Church, where I'm at, all of them except for one, which was an adoption, launched in rented or leased facilities. So yeah, you got to find a place too. Yeah.
That's right. And Paul, I don't mean to do this, but it feels like I'm asking other people what are the things to do, and I'm coming to you and what are the mistakes that you've made. Not that Sun Valley's doing a great job with multi-site, so I don't want that. I don't want you to think that but what are the mistakes that you made when it comes to locations?
Yeah, Tony, man, if someone else can go to school on what we've learned the last 5 years, then go for it. Some of it's been painful, some of it's been fun. All of it's produced a lot of really good results.
Good fruit there, that's for sure. That's right.
Yeah, I'll give you a really quick example. 2 locations that we have. One's in Casa Grande, a community about 45 minutes south of Phoenix metro area. And then our East Mesa location, which is, again, about 35 minutes east of Phoenix area. The East Mesa campus is small. It's really challenging when it comes to children's ministry space. The room actually only seats like 300 people, which is a really small venue for us. Parking is awful. They have to park on gravel. Casa Grande, on the other hand, it's a pitched floor, theater seating, really nice auditorium, seats over 500, great space for kids, all of that stuff. Casa Grande is not growing nearly at the pace that East Mesa is. And the reason why is, even though East Mesa's facility isn't as nice as Casa Grande's, location trumps facility every single time. East Mesa's in an area that, like Tammy mentioned, it's growing. Their guest ratio to attendance is super high. And people are clamoring to get in there. We've got to add more services. We've got to build that campus out. We have to feel what's happening there. Casa Grande, although it's a great facility, it's tucked away in a neighborhood. It's really hard to get to. And even though everybody knows where that auditorium is at in town, it's not a natural drive-by location. Traffic doesn't naturally go by that location. And so we've learned the hard way that isn't the right place in Casa Grande. If we have this conversation in another 9 months, Casa Grande is getting ready to switch locations. And everything we've learned through our experience, we're applying in that location. And so my hunch is it's probably going to double, triple in size in the next 12 months.
So let's take this a step further. One of the key questions that churches have to consider when they're launching a new location is, do we start in a portable setting, or do we try to find a permanent location? And what coaching would you give to churches as they're making that decision?
Well, I think you got to take a couple of things into consideration. If you're launching in a community where you can't find a facility that meets your actual ministry needs, in other words, the design of the physical space just doesn't meet what you're trying to accomplish, you may want to look at something that's portable. If you're trying to experiment with that market, you don't want to invest a lot of capital. Portability may be the route you want to go. For example, if you can't build a ground up building, or you can't get into a long-term lease and do all the TI needed to get the building to your use. It really comes down to cost benefit. And the other side of it is portability. It's tough. If you go portable more than 3 years, you really start chewing through volunteers, and it's hard to sustain momentum. And so if you do portable for a while, make sure you have a plan not to be portable.
Yeah, I have found for me personally, I mean, my own personal life, if something is just out there and I don't know when it's going to happen as far as the next step, I can get, anxious, stressed about it. And having the plan helps me. Just having the plan in place so that I know in this amount of time, this is the step that we're going to be able to take. And so I can see, particularly for the number of volunteers that's required to pull off a campus launch, that's pretty critical to have that future vision in place. Tammy, you're in a creative arts leadership role now. And on this topic of portable versus permanent, I would have to think it'd be much easier from an arts perspective, worship arts perspective, to be in a permanent space where whatever equipment you need to pull off the arts is always in the room. So help churches that are in a portable situation. What are some things they can be doing to still provide great worship arts in a portable setting?
Yeah, I mean, because at the end of the day, on our weekend services, there's two key pieces. There's the worship music piece, and there's the teaching. Then there's other arts pieces in between there. But in general, those are the two buckets. So when you're going multi-site, you can do teaching in almost any venue. If you're doing live teaching, if you're doing live streaming, I mean, even the cost of live streaming anymore, point to point over the public internet, is fairly reasonable. So the teaching part, you're going to be able to do in a portable location, probably relatively well. The music piece is different, and it's everybody's first impression. When people are coming into the church, one of the first things that they're going to see, the first part of the service anyway, is going to be music. So I would say one of the key things is don't cheap out on the equipment that you're purchasing to be able to produce the weekend music piece, whether that's mics and speakers and all those components you need, even to set up the environment of the stage if you're in a portable facility, to make it feel somewhat normal. Normal meaning there's going to be a significant number of people who are your core group who have come from your main campus, and you don't want to make the regional campus feel like the second class place where we have really much lesser good music and much lesser good everything. You want to do the best of your ability to make that music on the weekend, sound good. So, some would say that the percentage is anywhere from 20 to 28% of the startup budget would be into the technology side of things. So that's a pretty significant piece, but you really need to consider that investment. And then just even as you're looking at facility, you might want to consider things like acoustics. I mean, if you're in a portable facility, you're probably not going to get the most perfect acoustics, but at least consider that. Consider, is there a place to be able to store some of the equipment so you don't have to truck up everything back and forth? That's a big advantage. And then even the practicals like rehearsal, like can you get into that facility early or another time during the week to be able to rehearse so that, again, that you can create a quality product for the people. So.
Yeah. Paul, you're a numbers guy. Would you confirm similar percentage of investment required on technology?
I would, particularly if your experience at your original campus is a technology heavy experience, you want that experience to be as similar as possible, unless you don't care about your brand being eroded or you want to plant a church and not do a multi-site. So,
Okay. All right, good. All right. Well, let's turn our attention to the fourth mistake then. And this one is launching with the wrong team. And so here I want to focus, we've already talked about the campus pastor being kind of the leader of this team, but what does the makeup of the rest of the team need to look like? And Gavin, I want to start with you. At North Point, when you're getting ready to launch a new location, what are those essential staff or volunteer leadership roles that you see are required for this new location to have strength and success?
Sure. Let me back up just a hair on that, because again, we can't say it enough, but model determines the specific need. Model is going to determine everything that we do ultimately. However, part of the conversation in launching the campus, are we going to hope to have equal levels of excellence, equal levels of offering, right? Not every campus is going to be able to offer every ministry initially. So those are often things we build into. Student ministry is a great example of that, where a lot of times a campus may not have a high school or a middle school, high school environment initially, but they build into that in 6 months or a year. And so what you launch with from a staff perspective really is model dependent and dependent on what your hopes are. But for us in our context at North Point, we launch with relatively large campuses. And so we launch with a pretty robust team, but they're divided up into very easy kind of departments or categories. Obviously, there's a lead pastor involved in that, or a campus pastor. But there's some production pieces. There's so some staff in production, some staff with our children's, kid ministry, staff with student ministry. Groups for us is a foundational element. So we launch with some groups staff. Guest experience is something that we care a lot about, so we're going to launch also with someone who's overseeing that. And of course, there's a facilities or a ministry services side. Even for us, when we launched in a portable facility some 8 years ago for me, we still had a staff member who was overseeing facilities with us, because in a setup and tear down context, there's a lot to deal with, not just with the facility lease and the things like that. So for us, we're gonna make sure we backfill with that too. Now, of course, us launching with that many staff members, that's a lot of people. We don't have to launch with all of those as staff, though. It's very viable to staff what you can staff and backfill the other roles with volunteers, because there are people who love your mission and love your model enough. They would love nothing more than to come alongside of you and help support you, not just in a Sunday morning volunteer role, but maybe in something even more robust than that.
Yeah, and then the reverse is true too. If you feel like you have to staff some of these leadership roles, then that is going to impact the scope or the size of the launch that's going to be required to sustain that. And just if you want a rough ballpark number, it's probably going to be anywhere from 125 to 150 people per full-time equivalent staff person at that campus location. And so if you need a full-time campus pastor and you think you need a full-time worship leader and a full-time kids minister and a full-time youth pastor on staff, great. Just do the math. You need to multiply by 5. Then in that example, the number of attendees that are required to sustain a staff that large.
Right.
Gavin, you were going to follow up.
Yeah, that goes back to Paul's point earlier. He mentioned maybe 1,000 people, and obviously the context and the model determines some of that number. But
right.
Paul, I have to imagine that's part of why that number is important for you in your context, because you know what the excellent level needs to be. You know what quality, you know what ministry offerings you want to begin with. And so therefore, do the math, right? It's easy to know from a 140-to-1 ratio how many people you're going to need to have there to support the staff that you believe will be necessary to make that campus what you want it to be. So.
All right. So, Gavin, we're sending out folks in either staff or volunteer roles to lead teams, but gosh, we're also building teams of volunteers that are going to be going out to this new location. And I would think we want to send our best for that campus to have success, for it to be healthy.
Yeah.
So help me and help the folks that are listening. What are some strategies we can use for the sending locations because they're going to be sending out some of their best leaders and some of their best volunteer team members to this new campus that we're launching. What's some of the strategy that we can use to set the sending location up for success too?
Sure. Well, probably the best strategy is to think with the end in mind. The launching of a campus doesn't begin when we launch a campus. The launching of a campus begins years before the campus is launched, where we're beginning to create the second round of fantastic leadership in the local church so that that first group is prepared to lead and launch a new church. So for us, we're going to be apprenticing leaders all the time. Our goal is not just to fill the volunteer roles that we have. Our goal is to overfill the volunteer roles that we have so that when we are ready to launch that new campus, we can send some of the best, Tony, but also have people prepared and ready to step into those gaps. One of the best parts about sending those great people to launch that new campus is it creates space for new great people with new, fresh eyes who see things in a different way to step into a role that they have been being prepared to step into. And so from a strategy perspective, for us, we cast vision all the time around how if you love this church, the reason that you love it partially is because people came before you to help create what you love. Now, you get the chance to do the same thing for other people that other people did for you. And so thinking that way has allowed us to backfill well because we're thinking years in advance. We're not reacting to the launch of that moment.
All right, Tammy, continuing this conversation about building teams for multi-site. You've been a team builder in the church going back many years. And so you know the priority of this, but what does this importance of building volunteer teams tell us about the types of staff leaders we need to hire for these new locations?
Yeah, in general, one of the biggest cultural shifts that a church needs to make as it grows, whether it's a church that's one site and growing from 500 to 1,000, or it's going multi-site for the first time, is the type of leader, type of people that they hire. And so we've all say this, we've all heard it 25 zillion times, but you need to hire leaders who are equippers, not doers. And so like we hear it, and like for real, that really does make a difference. So there is a total place in the kingdom for the people who are the doers. They love the one-on-one conversations. They love the one-on-one coaching. They love the one-on-one counseling. There are shepherds. They're like some of our most loved staffers and key volunteers, but there's not a place for them in our core leadership roles. And quite honestly, we'll never be able to afford, if you're trying to staff your church only on doers, you'll never be able to afford it, and it'll cap your growth every time. So you really got to look at the type of people that you're hiring and really hire people who love to lead the leaders, to train leaders, just exactly what Gavin was just talking about. They're investing in other people. Their joy for ministry does not come from simply them being the ones doing the ministry, but they love to be the equippers of that, and that makes all the difference. So yeah.
Very good. All right. So we've been through the 4 mistakes, and we're about ready to shift now into a time of Q&A, and I'm looking forward to some of the questions that came in. Blake's been helping us capture those in the background. Good job, Blake. You did well today. But before we get to the questions, let me tell you about a couple of resources, opportunities that the Unstuck Group is providing for churches that are engaging in multi-site. The first is an opportunity that's coming starting this spring. We're launching a few different coaching networks. And when we do coaching networks at the Unstuck Group, we do this in teams. We're encouraging team-based ministry with all the churches we engage. So even when we do a coaching network, we're inviting the senior pastor and one other senior leader from each church to join us. We have a specific coaching network of the 3. We have one specifically focused on multi-site leadership. And there are a couple of others on reaching 1,000 and reaching 2,000. But if you're interested in joining one of these coaching networks, particularly the one around multi-site, I want to encourage you, you need to sign up soon. We have limited space in all of these networks, particularly the multi-site network. Paul, who's been on the panel today, will be one of the facilitators along with Amy Anderson. One of the sharp leaders we have on our team at the Unstuck Group has a lot of multi-site experience from her days at Eagle Brook Church up in the Minneapolis area, another large multi-site church. If you want to join one of those coaching networks, you need to register by April 1st. No full. April 1st is the deadline for that. And then a second opportunity, if you want a little bit more focused attention for where your church is now and where you're heading as you potentially engage in multi-site, this is part of what we do at the Unstuck Group, is we come alongside churches and help them assess their readiness for multi-site. We help them create the strategy for multi-site. We prepare them for launch, and then we help them look at their staffing and structure for multi-site, because staffing and structure changes once you start launching multiple locations. So a couple opportunities that are out there for you if you're looking for next steps when it comes to multi-site. Let me turn to the questions now. And the first one here, and I know for sure Paul and Gavin have had some experience in your churches absorbing other congregations. Now the question was, is it possible to absorb a dying congregation as another, as a second location for multi-site? You guys have absorbed other churches, but they weren't dying churches, were they? Paul, I'll let you jump on that one first.
So the question, is it possible? Yes, it's possible.
Yes.
We've done two. One was one that we planted, and years later that pastor went to go do a different role, and they came back to us. And so there was cultural similarity, very natural expression of one another. We did one that was declining. In fact, it had been a church in decline for 18 years. That one was much, much more difficult because you have a collision of culture. One church that's growing and a certain kind of staff that are part of that kind of organization, and one church that's declining and a certain kind of staff that's a part of that organization. And so there was a collision of culture. One culture has to win. You cannot merge culture. One culture has to wash over the other. And so, yeah, that'd be the real Reader's Digest version of that one.
All right. And Gavin, I mean, it was your location. You were a separate church previously, and North Point absorbed you as a campus, but you were not declining. You were actually you were healthy. You were growing. So, yeah, speak into this question a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I think, Paul, to what you just said, part of the fear is that one culture is going to win, and you don't want the declining culture to be the one that wins. And so I would say for us at North Point, we are not in the business of taking over dying churches. We would never say it this way probably, but we're more in the business of a hostile takeover if we're going to do that. And here's why. We don't want to combine the two brands, combine the two cultures. We only know how to do church one way. And it's not the best way, and it's not necessarily the only way. We know that isn't true. It's just our way. And so trying to meld together multiple cultures, I'm not sure that's ultimately the most successful approach to multi-site. So now, if there's facilities, if there's things that make it advantageous, sure, that can be possible. However, I think I would always advise people to not try to combine. I would try to make it a hostile takeover. Don't use the term, but that's, I think, ultimately the best way to handle it. So
yeah, I mean, eventually, if ultimately you want that church to keep their identity, their strategy, their people, their brand, then they should stay an independent church. Right. Or if you're wanting to launch different types of churches with different identities and different strategies and different cultures, then you should use church planting as the model for replication, which is a very viable option. Today, we're talking about multi-site strategy. And in this case, yeah, go ahead, Gavin.
And no one is looking, no church leader is looking to take on the model of a dying organization and adopt it into their model, right? So we want to steer clear from that. I mean, you mentioned ours. I mean, we were growing and we were making a lot of progress in our culture. I was the third lead pastor in the first 3 years. So there was a lot of things that had to be undone and rebuilt. But North Point became interested in us joining forces when we got really healthy, not to help us get healthy. Because again, no one wants to take on the dying organization because it doesn't add as much, it just doesn't add value that way.
Tammy, I want to turn to you here. This question is, we're going to start building a team. We're going to hire people. We're going to add volunteers. And by the way, we're going to have to unmute you for this, for you to respond too. So when that happens, when do you actually start building the team before the launch? How much time is required to find the leader, the campus pastor, to hire the staff, and then to start building these volunteer teams? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, they're actually part of your staff team for a year or so, a minimum. To really absorb the culture before launching it. So an example would be, so at Christ Community Church where I'm at, for the worship pastor role. So there's a lot of, sometimes there's roles, people that you can, you're developing within, you can send out. Sometimes there's people that you're developing to launch out that are volunteers, but worship pastors are a little bit more distinct. It's not harder to, find them. So we, the last 2 times have brought on young guys, and they were part of our team. They actually rotated around the campuses, were part of our central team meetings. So they've really got a chance to lead in different venues around our campuses. They got a chance to understand how we plan weekend services, how we choose music. They got coaching and into how, they were leading the services. And then after they were both there about 9 months, so they weren't there a full year before we sent them then out to a campus. But then they were ready to rock and roll. They were ready to go. They had our DNA. They knew just exactly why we did what we did. And so the DNA transfer was so good with that. So yeah, in a perfect world, it's more than a couple months.
Paul, I think this one will be a good one for you because I know you like numbers too, but what are some of the key benchmarks that you think define success for a new campus and generally multi-site strategy as a whole?
Well, I think it starts with what are the key success indicators for your original campus.
There you go.
I'm not sure that I would change it very much. I mean, it's probably going to be how many people are saying yes to following Jesus, how many people are being baptized, how many people are getting in groups, how many people are getting assimilated and jumping into volunteer roles, how many people are giving. If it were me, I would set, what are our goals based on what success looks like in our model for the first teaching series in the first 90 days, first 6 months, first year.
Yeah. And you do this, I'm assuming, with your campus pastors, right? You kind of here's kind of a benchmark of what we anticipate, and there's some accountability there. Is that true?
Yes, I am not paying I'm not paying our campus pastors to be my friend. I have friends, and really, they have a real job to do, and we're about helping people meet, know, and follow Jesus. And if that's not happening, we're going to figure out how to help people meet, know, and follow Jesus.
There you go. I mean, if we were in business launching other locations, the bottom line would be profitability. For us, our bottom line is life change. People come to know Jesus and taking steps to their faith and becoming disciple makers. And there should be some accountability to that bottom line for these new locations. Gavin, I think this will be interesting to get your perspective on this because it's the branding question. And should these new locations carry the same brand, or should it be distinct? And I think it's an interesting question for you because obviously North Point is not North Point in every location, is it?
No, it's not. We have always been under the impression that we would rather create great local churches than just create great campuses. So the local church in a local community trumps the campus language. In fact, we don't even call ourselves campus pastors. We call ourselves lead pastors, and that's the reason, because we want to be local leaders and local pastors. However, we have brands within the larger brand that are the same. So for instance, my location is Woodstock City Church, not North Point, west side of Atlanta. However, Wambaland, that's the brand that we leverage for preschool, and we leverage it in all 6 locations. So there are economies of scale that we leverage, right, with those brands that we spread across each location. However, we do use unique location names because our vision is to create churches that unchurched people love to attend, and unchurched people in my community do not know anything about North Point. They don't care about Andy Stanley. They don't even care about going to Alpharetta, Georgia. So for us, the brand of North Point is irrelevant to the market who we are trying to reach anyway. So we think about it more about how can we leverage the economy of scale in the brands more than we can about the overall brand itself.
Paul, this person's acknowledging, obviously with multi-site, it's going to be a similar vision, similar culture, similar strategy. But then the question is, how do you deal with the differences in the community itself?
Well, I think if you have a unique context, then you act uniquely. It'd be the same thing as being a slave to your policy at your church. You don't serve your policy serves you. And so if you have a unique situation, well, goodness, give yourself the freedom to act uniquely. That being said, working with churches all over the country, people are people. And there aren't, unless there's socioeconomic differences, demographic differences, one's urban, one's rural, one's suburban. Now you start getting into two different approaches. But suburban America is suburban America. Urban America is urban America. Rural America is rural America. And I think that's an oversimplification. But that'd be my 2 cents on that.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. And, you know, for us with 6 locations, we do have some that are, I mean, they're all relatively suburban, but we have some that are kind of inside the city limits of Atlanta, you know, kind of in some of those urban, more hip areas. Well, the music, our approach to worship, some of those things are a little different in that location. But as a model in multi-site, we decided early on to be a little more decentralized, giving the local leadership more autonomy to make those kind of community or contextual decisions. And so for us, again, people are people. And from the truth, from the content, from the preaching, a lot of that is similar. But our kind of contextualization of the wrappers around some of the other things are going to feel a little different because each of our communities are a little bit different.
Yeah, Tammy, I'd like for you to speak into this a little bit too, as it relates to the worship aspect of the services. I think you said Christ Community Churches in 5 different locations. Do you sense that the worship experience has to be different for those 5 different communities?
So we've taken the tactic that we plan the services together, but for the most part, we're doing pretty much the same worship set. So we are doing the same music at all locations, but it's very collaborative. Part of that is because part of the DNA of our church is there's a theming to the music and there's a connection to the overall theme of the teaching. So for that reason, and because we do live stream the teaching most of the time, so for that reason, there's an importance and just a practicality of planning the music together in accordance to the theme. And then we all execute pretty much similarly. That, you know, that said, there's still uniquenesses. There's times where one of the campuses will do something a little bit, you know, different or in a different style, and that's totally fine and good. So.
Very good. All right. We had many other questions that we don't have time to get to today, but first of all, let me thank our panelists, Paul, Gavin, Tammy, thank you for joining us today for the conversation. Blake, thank you for your hard work in the background. We'll try to, in the content that comes out in the coming days and weeks, we'll try to answer other questions that came in during our conversation. Let me just remind you a couple of things. First of all, you'll be getting an email later today with a replay of today's webinar. So if you heard something today that you think someone else from your team needs to hear, you'll have the opportunity later today to share the content. And then a final reminder, that deadline for the coaching networks is coming on April 1st. So particularly if you want to join us for the multi-site leadership coaching network, please register. We'd love to have you be a part of that, but you have to do that before April 1st. All right. Really appreciate you joining us today. Again, we want to do everything we can at the Unstuck Group to help your church find health, find growth, and anything we can do to help you get unstuck, we want to be about that. So thanks for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you again in the future.